$15,000 says you can't hit steel at 600 yards with open sights. The challenge boomed across the outdoor range through a portable speaker, followed by a wave of laughter that rolled beneath a bright autumn sky. Phones lifted. Cameras turned. A giant digital display beside the firing line flashed the growing prize pool while a live stream counter climbed past 200,000 viewers. One after another, experienced marksmen had stepped onto the line, adjusted their breathing, squeezed their triggers, and walked away shaking their heads as the distant steel plate remained stubbornly silent. Expensive rifles had failed. Precision ammunition had failed. Confidence had failed. The host smiled wider with every miss because every failure meant another viral clip and another flood of comments, insisting the shot simply couldn't be made without a scope. The betting board refreshed again. $15,000. One impossible shot. Then someone quietly cleared his throat. Few people noticed the old man until he was already walking toward the registration table with an old wooden rifle case hanging naturally from one weathered hand. He moved without hurry, without hesitation, and without the slightest interest in the crowd that instinctively parted around him. His name was Walter Hayes. 84 years old. White hair tucked beneath a faded ball cap. Worn denim jacket that had seen more seasons than most people at the range had birthdays. His boots carried a thin layer of country dust, and every step landed with the calm certainty of someone who had never felt the need to impress strangers. The young volunteer behind the table barely looked up before smiling politely. "Sir, spectators stay behind the yellow line." Walter nodded once. "I'm not here to watch." The volunteer blinked. "I'm here for the bet," Walter said. The words were soft enough that only the people nearest him heard them, yet somehow the sentence spread faster than shouting. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A few competitors exchanged amused looks before breaking into open laughter. The host lowered his microphone just enough to grin at the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've got ourselves a legend." More laughter followed. Someone whispered that the old rifle case probably belonged in a museum. Another guessed it held a family heirloom that hadn't fired in decades. The live stream chat exploded with jokes before Walter even opened the latches. He didn't answer a single one. His pale blue eyes drifted past the firing line toward the distant hillside where sunlight shimmered above the dry grass. Tiny ribbons tied to wind poles fluttered in different directions, but he wasn't looking at the ribbons. He watched the floating dust. The wavering heat above the gravel. A hawk circling far beyond the berm. The host noticed the silence on the old man's face and raised the microphone again. "Sir, just so everyone understands, this challenge is 600 yards using open sights only. No optics. No magnification. No second chances. Are you absolutely sure you want to try?" Walter finally met his eyes. There wasn't pride in his expression. There wasn't irritation either. Only a stillness that felt strangely out of place amid the noise of cameras, wagers, and endless opinions. "I've been sure since I parked my truck," he replied. The laughter came again, louder than before. Walter never blinked. Walter knelt beside the old rifle case and released the brass latches with practiced fingers that never hurried. The hinges opened without a squeak, revealing a rifle wrapped inside a faded cotton cloth that had been washed so many times its original color had disappeared into a soft gray. He folded the fabric with surprising care before setting it aside. The rifle resting beneath it drew puzzled looks instead of admiration. It was walnut and blued steel, worn smooth where countless hands had once carried it. There were no rails, no carbon fiber stock, no oversized barrel, and certainly no expensive optic mounted above the receiver. Even from several feet away, people could see tiny scratches scattered across the wood like a map of forgotten years. Ryan Brooks folded his arms and stepped closer with the confident grin that had helped him build millions of followers online. He had tested custom rifles that cost more than used pickup trucks. Companies paid him to review precision equipment. Every lesson he had ever learned insisted that technology won. Looking down at Walter's rifle, he almost felt disappointed. "That is what you brought?" he asked, unable to hide the amusement in his voice. No scope. No match chassis. No custom trigger. You are planning to shoot 600 yards with military iron sights? Walter simply nodded as he inspected the front sight blade beneath the morning sun. Ryan laughed quietly before turning toward the cameras. Folks, this is exactly why I love these events. Confidence is free. The crowd answered with scattered applause and cheerful whistles. Someone shouted that the old rifle belonged over a fireplace. Another guessed it had not been fired since the 1970s. Walter ignored every comment. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small cloth that smelled faintly of linseed oil. Slowly he wiped the rear sight, then the front blade, not because they were dirty, but because habit demanded it. His movements were deliberate enough to make even the impatient volunteers watch in silence. One young competitor leaned over the table to read the registration form. Walter Hayes, he murmured. Never heard of him. Neither had Ryan. He accepted the scorecard from the range official and glanced toward the distant steel plate shimmering against the hillside. Through binoculars it looked barely larger than a dinner plate. Without magnification, it was nothing more than a pale speck floating in the afternoon haze. The host raised his microphone once more. Before we begin, standard safety inspection. Walter handed over the rifle without protest. The range officer, a broad-shouldered man named Michael Carter, accepted it with professional routine. He checked the chamber, examined the sights, and paused almost imperceptibly as his thumb brushed across the walnut stock. There, just behind the receiver, rested a deep scar in the wood unlike the ordinary scratches earned through age. It was smooth around the edges, as though countless hands had traced it over many decades. Michael frowned for only a heartbeat before continuing the inspection. Everything looks good, he announced, returning the rifle. Walter accepted it with both hands, and for the first time his fingertips rested lightly against that old mark. His expression did not change, yet something distant settled behind his pale blue eyes. The laughter around him faded into the background. The smell of fresh coffee drifting from the concession stand seemed to disappear. Even the voices from the live stream became strangely hollow, as though the range itself had begun slipping farther away while an old memory, patient and silent, waited just beyond the edge of the present. Walter's fingers remained on the old scar for only a moment before he lifted the rifle and rested it gently across the shooting bench. The memory waiting behind his eyes stayed exactly where it was, neither welcomed nor pushed away. Ryan noticed the brief pause and mistook it for uncertainty. He smiled into one of the cameras positioned only a few feet away. This is usually the part where reality sets in, he said. 600 yards looks very different when you are standing on the firing line. A ripple of laughter swept through the spectators. Walter neither answered nor looked offended. Instead, he reached into the rifle case once more and removed a simple leather sling, its edges polished by decades of use. He attached it with slow, practiced movements that seemed almost ceremonial. One young competitor shook his head. Nobody uses those anymore. Another answered with a grin. Neither does anybody use iron sights for this distance. The comments blended into the steady hum of conversation while phones continued recording every movement. Ryan stepped closer, careful not to cross the firing line. Mind if I ask you something? Walter looked up. Go ahead. Ryan pointed toward the rifle. How far have you actually practiced with open sights? Walter studied him for a second before answering. Far enough. Ryan chuckled. That is not really a number. Walter gave the faintest hint of a smile. The wind never cared much about numbers. The answer earned another round of laughter, but Michael Carter did not laugh. The range officer had been watching the old man's eyes instead of his words. Most shooters stared directly at the target. Walter hardly glanced at it. His attention wandered across the hillside, following patches of sunlight crawling over dry grass. He watched a loose feather drift across the gravel before disappearing into a shallow dip beside the berm. He noticed a faint shimmer rising from sun-baked rocks halfway to the steel plate. Then he tilted his head slightly toward a line of cottonwood trees standing hundreds of yards beyond the target. Their highest leaves moved almost imperceptibly while the lower branches remained perfectly still. Michael frowned again. That was not how recreational shooters read conditions. It was how old professionals observed an entire landscape before making a single decision. Ryan kept talking to entertain the live stream. You know, everyone thinks distance is the hardest part. It is not. Mirage changes everything. Heat changes everything. Even a tiny breeze can push a bullet farther than people expect. Walter nodded politely. That is true. Ryan spread his hands confidently. Which is exactly why scopes exist. Walter's eyes returned to the distant hillside. Scopes help you see the target. They cannot teach you how the ground breathes. For the first time since the challenge began, Ryan had no immediate comeback. The sentence sounded strange, almost old-fashioned, yet Michael felt an unexpected chill run through him. He had heard words like that before. Years earlier. Spoken by men who had learned marksmanship long before ballistic computers and laser rangefinders became common. He looked again at the scar on the walnut stalk. Something about it refused to leave his mind. Quietly, without drawing attention, Michael stepped back toward the registration office and reached for the radio clipped to his belt. His voice stayed low enough that the crowd never noticed. Control, this is Carter. I need a favor. Can you check if anyone has records on a shooter named Walter Hayes? I have a feeling this afternoon is about to become a lot more interesting than any of us expected. The radio on Michael Carter's belt answered with nothing more than a burst of static before a calm voice replied that the name would take a few minutes to search. Michael acknowledged the message without taking his eyes off Walter. Something about the old man refused to fit the picture everyone else had already painted. It was not confidence. He had seen confidence collapse under pressure too many times. This was something quieter. Something settled. Ryan noticed Michael's attention and walked over with an amused smile. You really think he has a chance? Michael chose his words carefully. I think he has done this before. Ryan laughed. Nobody has done this before. Michael did not answer. Instead, he watched as Walter picked up a single cartridge from a small cardboard box that looked almost as old as the rifle itself. The brass caught the afternoon sunlight for only a second before disappearing into the open action with a soft metallic click that sounded almost delicate against the constant chatter of the crowd. Walter closed the bolts slowly. There was no dramatic flourish. No performance for the cameras. Every movement seemed guided by habit rather than excitement. Ryan stepped closer again, unable to resist one more question. Can I at least see those sights? Walter handed him the rifle without hesitation. Ryan raised it to shoulder height, looked through the rear aperture, and immediately frowned. These are tiny. He lowered the rifle and shook his head. You can barely see the target. Walter answered with complete sincerity. You are not supposed to see only the target. Ryan looked puzzled. Then what are you supposed to see? Walter glanced across the valley once more. Everything between you and it. Ryan gave the rifle back with a polite smile that barely concealed his disbelief. As he returned to the firing line, his hand brushed against the deep scar carved into the walnut stalk. It was only the lightest touch, but the instant Walter's eyes followed that movement, the noise around him seemed to dissolve. The laughter became distant. The voices from the live stream faded into a hollow murmur. Even the warm smell of fresh coffee disappeared beneath the clean scent of pine carried by a mountain breeze from another season and another lifetime. The worn mark beneath his fingertips was no ordinary dent. Decades earlier, it had been fresh splintered wood left by a fragment that struck the rifle instead of the young man carrying it across a rocky hillside. He remembered kneeling beside a wind-twisted cedar, while the afternoon sun painted shimmering waves across distant stone. There had been no electronic weather station. No laser rangefinder. No ballistic calculator. Only patience. The land had spoken through moving grass, drifting seeds, circling birds, and rising heat, and an older instructor standing quietly beside him had smiled before saying words that never left him. Do not chase the target, Walter. Listen to the country between you and the target. It will always tell you where your bullet wants to go. The memory lingered for only a heartbeat before the present returned. Walter blinked once and gently rested his thumb over the old scar. Across the range, Michael's radio crackled again. The dispatcher sounded different this time, quieter than before. Carter, we found something on Walter Hayes. Stay on the line. You are going to want to hear this. Michael turned slightly away from the crowd so the conversation on his radio would remain private, but the words coming through the speaker immediately slowed his breathing. Walter Hayes. United States Army. Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol. Honorably discharged. Qualified expert marksman every recorded year of service. Michael listened without interrupting. The dispatcher continued after a brief pause. There is one unusual note attached to his file. Several training records remain restricted, but there is a recommendation letter preserved in the archive from a retired brigadier general. It describes Hayes as one of the finest natural readers of terrain and wind conditions ever evaluated. Michael looked across the firing line toward the quiet old man who was simply standing beside his rifle, waiting for permission to begin. Nothing about Walter demanded attention, yet suddenly every ordinary detail seemed different. The faded jacket no longer looked neglected. It looked familiar, like something worn because comfort mattered more than appearance. The old rifle was no longer an outdated relic. It had become a companion that had traveled through countless seasons without ever being replaced. Michael thanked the dispatcher and clipped the radio back onto his belt, but one sentence refused to leave his thoughts. Natural reader of terrain and wind. That was exactly what he had been watching since Walter arrived. The old man had barely looked at the target itself. Instead, he had studied the invisible conversation taking place across 600 yards of open ground. Walter rested both hands lightly on the shooting bench while the afternoon breeze shifted almost imperceptibly from left to right. His eyes followed a cluster of dry leaves as they tumbled across the gravel before settling near a patch of golden grass. High above the range, two hawks drifted in slow circles without flapping their wings. Their effortless movement revealed rising columns of warm air that no electronic display could fully explain. The distant heat shimmered differently than it had only a few minutes earlier, bending the horizon into gentle waves that rolled across the valley like water. Walter noticed every change without appearing to search for any of them. His expression remained peaceful, almost thoughtful, as though he were greeting an old friend after many years apart. The memory of another hillside lingered quietly beneath the surface of his thoughts. He remembered standing beside the instructor who had shaped his understanding of marksmanship long before modern technology transformed the sport. The older man had never carried the newest equipment. Instead, he carried patience. One afternoon, after watching young Walter struggle to understand changing conditions, the instructor had scooped a handful of dry grass from the ground and released it into the air. The tiny strands floated, twisted, and scattered in different directions before finally settling. The instructor smiled and said, "The wind is honest, but it never speaks only once. If you only listen where you are standing, you will always hear an incomplete story." Walter had carried those words through every season that followed. Back in the present, Ryan continued entertaining the live stream audience with confident predictions about the challenge ahead, completely unaware that Michael was no longer watching the cameras or the comments scrolling across thousands of phone screens. He was watching Walter. For the first time that afternoon, the range officer found himself wondering whether everyone else had misunderstood what they had come to witness. Perhaps this was never going to be a contest between an old man and a distant steel plate. Perhaps it was about to become a lesson in the kind of knowledge that could never be purchased, upgraded, or downloaded, because it had been earned one quiet observation at a time over the course of an entire lifetime. Michael stepped away from the firing line and entered the small range office where the afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty windows lined with faded competition plaques. He closed the door behind him just enough to soften the noise outside before pulling a worn directory from beneath the front desk. The dispatcher had given him a name along with Walter Hayes. Colonel Thomas Whitaker, retired. Michael dialed the number with little expectation that anyone would answer. After 3 rings, a calm voice greeted him. "Whitaker speaking." Michael introduced himself and explained the situation. There was a brief silence before the retired colonel asked one simple question. "Did you say Walter Hayes?" "Yes, sir." Another pause followed, longer this time. Michael could hear the faint ticking of a clock on the other end of the line. Finally the colonel spoke again, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had not forgotten a single detail despite the passing years. "Do not let him leave until I get there." Michael blinked. "Sir? How far am I from your range?" Michael gave him the location. "About 40 minutes if traffic cooperates." "Then I will be there in 30. The call ended before Michael could ask another question. He stared at the silent phone for several seconds before slipping it back into his pocket. Outside, the atmosphere had grown louder. The live stream audience had climbed even higher, and spectators continued placing friendly side bets over whether the old man would even touch the steel plate. Ryan Brooks welcomed every prediction with his usual polished confidence, pacing comfortably in front of the cameras while explaining wind drift and bullet drop to thousands of viewers. His information was accurate, yet Michael found himself barely listening anymore. He walked back onto the range and immediately noticed Walter standing exactly where he had been several minutes earlier. He had not grown impatient. He had not looked at his watch. He had not spoken to anyone. Instead, he watched a pair of swallows dart gracefully across the valley, changing direction almost instantly as invisible currents lifted them above the rolling grass. Walter's eyes followed their effortless movement before drifting toward a patch of shimmering heat rising from the rocky slope halfway to the target. The breeze touched the collar of his faded jacket for only a moment, but he seemed to understand something from that brief whisper of air alone. Michael approached quietly. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter turned with a polite smile. "Yes? Would you mind waiting just a little longer before taking your shot?" Ryan overheard the request and looked confused. "Why delay now? Everything is ready." Michael chose his words carefully. "Someone is on the way." Ryan laughed. "Another challenger?" Michael shook his head. "No. Someone who asked me to make sure Mr. Hayes was still here when he arrived." Walter's expression remained unchanged, but a faint spark of recognition appeared in his pale blue eyes when Michael quietly added one more sentence. "The name was Colonel Thomas Whitaker." Walter looked toward the distant mountains for a long moment before the smallest smile crossed his face. It was not the smile of surprise. It was the smile of someone remembering an old friend after many quiet years. Without another word, he rested one hand gently on the worn walnut stock of his rifle while the afternoon wind shifted once again, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass across the range as though time itself had slowed down to wait for whatever was about to happen next. The announcement that a retired colonel was on his way spread through the range far faster than anyone expected. Nobody knew why an ordinary shooting challenge suddenly mattered to someone who had once worn eagles on his shoulders, but speculation quickly replaced laughter. Some guessed the colonel had simply been invited to present the prize. Others believed he wanted to witness the final attempt before heading home. Ryan Brooks shrugged at the growing excitement and smiled toward the nearest camera. "Well, I guess our mystery keeps getting better. While we wait, let us see if our challenger wants to get settled." Walter nodded politely and stepped behind the firing line. He did not shoulder the rifle. He did not rush to adjust his position. Instead, he stood quietly with both hands resting on the worn walnut stock while his eyes traveled across the valley one more time. The afternoon sun had shifted enough to change the color of the hillside from pale gold to deep amber. Long shadows stretched across the dry grass. The shimmering air above the rocks became softer, almost slower, while the breeze that had drifted steadily from left to right began fading into uncertain currents. Most people never noticed changes like that. Walter noticed every one of them. A spectator checked the digital wind meter mounted beside the bench and announced the latest reading with confidence. Walter never looked at the display. His attention remained fixed on a single cottonwood leaf that loosened from an upper branch and floated gently toward the ground, changing direction twice before finally disappearing behind a weathered fence post. He watched a small cloud slide across the sun, lowering the temperature just enough for the distant mirage to weaken. Nearby, a pair of meadowlarks landed in the tall grass before lifting off together only seconds later. Every tiny movement added another piece to a picture that existed only inside his mind. Ryan finally stepped closer. "Mr. Hayes, people are wondering why you are waiting. Conditions look pretty good right now." Walter smiled faintly without taking his eyes off the valley. "They are changing." Ryan looked around in confusion. "The meter says almost no wind." Walter nodded. "That is where the meter is standing." Ryan glanced toward the device, then back toward the old man, uncertain whether he had just been corrected or quietly taught something. Around them, the live stream chat continued racing across countless screens. Some viewers begged Walter to hurry. Others joked that he was looking for excuses. A few insisted he had already lost because confidence without action meant nothing. Walter heard none of it. Silence had become his companion long ago, and it protected him from noise that served no purpose. Michael Carter noticed the same calm expression that had never changed since the old man first walked onto the property. There was no tension in his shoulders. No restless movement in his hands. No trace of someone preparing to prove anything. He looked like a man waiting for the land itself to finish speaking. Then, from beyond the entrance gate, the distant sound of an approaching engine drifted across the range. Heads turned almost together as a dark sedan rolled slowly through the gravel driveway, raising a thin ribbon of dust behind it. The conversations faded one by one until only the crunch of tires remained. Walter finally lifted his eyes from the valley and looked toward the arriving vehicle. His expression softened with quiet recognition, as though another chapter of a story that had been waiting for decades was finally ready to continue. The dark sedan came to a gentle stop beside the range office, and for a moment nobody moved. Even the live stream host lowered his microphone without realizing it. The driver stepped out first and opened the rear door. An elderly man wearing a navy blazer climbed carefully onto the gravel, straightened his posture, and surveyed the firing line with calm, searching eyes. Time had added silver to Colonel Thomas Whitaker's hair, but it had not diminished the quiet authority he carried. Michael Carter walked forward to greet him, but the colonel barely slowed his pace. "Where is he?" he asked. Michael pointed toward the firing line. Walter Hayes stood exactly where he had been, one hand resting lightly on the walnut stock of his rifle. As the colonel approached, Walter smiled with the unmistakable warmth reserved for an old friend rather than a superior officer. Neither man hurried. They met halfway between the benches and the registration table. Ryan expected a handshake. The cameras expected introductions. Instead, Colonel Whitaker came to a complete stop, looked Walter directly in the eyes, and gave him a crisp military salute. Every conversation across the range ended instantly. Walter returned the salute with the same quiet precision, holding it only long enough for years of shared memories to pass silently between them. When both hands lowered, the colonel smiled. "You still make people wait until the conditions are right." Walter chuckled softly. "You finally learned to be patient." The small exchange puzzled nearly everyone listening, but Michael understood enough to realize he was watching respect earned over a lifetime rather than ceremony performed for an audience. Ryan stepped forward cautiously. "Colonel, you know Mr. Hayes?" Whitaker turned toward him. "Know him?" He looked back at Walter with unmistakable admiration. "I trusted him with decisions that no instrument could make better." Ryan's confident smile faded. "You mean competitive shooting?" The colonel shook his head. "No. I mean judgment. There are people who learn equipment, and there are people who learn the land itself." Walter belonged to the second group. Silence settled over the crowd once more. Nobody laughed now. Even the live stream comments slowed as viewers sensed that something far more meaningful than an internet challenge was unfolding. Whitaker stepped beside Walter and quietly looked toward the distant steel plate shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. "Still reading the valley before the sights?" Walter nodded. "The valley changes first. The target only tells you where to finish." The colonel smiled as though hearing words he had not forgotten in decades. "Then I suppose it is finally ready." Walter drew one slow breath and walked to the firing position. He adjusted the leather sling around his supporting arm with practiced ease before settling naturally behind the rifle. There was no dramatic movement. No theatrical pause. His breathing blended with the gentle breeze crossing the open ground. He watched the cottonwood leaves become still. He waited for the last shimmer of heat to soften above the rocks. Somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called once before the valley returned to perfect quiet. Walter exhaled slowly, his finger resting calmly against the trigger, as though time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Every camera focused on him. Every spectator held their breath. The only sound remaining across 600 yards of open country was the whisper of wind moving through dry grass as Walter's eyes settled behind the simple iron sights one final time. Walter remained perfectly still until the valley gave him the answer he had been waiting for. The breeze settled. The shimmering air above the rocks softened into a steady pattern. The cottonwood leaves stopped trembling for the briefest moment, and the silence across 600 yards of open ground felt complete. He drew one final breath, allowed half of it to leave naturally, and pressed the trigger with the same calm patience that had shaped his entire life. The rifle spoke with a single sharp report before returning to stillness in his hands. Nobody moved. Nobody celebrated. Every eye remained fixed on the distant hillside as the sound traveled across the open country. Then, after what felt much longer than it truly was, the clear ringing note of steel echoed back through the valley. It was bright, unmistakable, and impossibly clean. For a heartbeat the entire range stood frozen. Ryan Brooks lowered his binoculars slowly, looked again through the lenses as though his eyes had betrayed him, and then lowered them once more. The white circle at the center of the steel plate swayed gently against the afternoon light. The live stream host forgot to speak. The scrolling comments slowed almost to nothing before exploding with disbelief. Some viewers demanded another camera angle. Others insisted it had to be luck. Michael Carter quietly smiled because he had watched every second leading to that single moment, and he knew luck had never entered the conversation. Colonel Whitaker simply folded his hands behind his back and nodded once, exactly as though an old promise had been fulfilled. Walter eased the rifle onto the bench and removed the leather sling from his arm without the slightest hint of celebration. His expression had not changed because he had never come to prove strangers wrong. Ryan walked toward him carrying the oversized ceremonial check that had been prepared before the event. The confidence that usually filled every step had been replaced by genuine respect. He stopped in front of Walter and extended the check with both hands. "Sir," he said quietly, "I was wrong about you." Walter accepted the check with a grateful nod, studied it for only a second, then turned toward Michael. "Does this range work with any local veteran organizations?" Michael blinked in surprise. "Yes, we do." Walter smiled. "Good. Please make sure every dollar goes to them." Ryan stared at him in disbelief. "You are giving it all away?" Walter looked toward the distant steel plate one last time before answering. "The shot was never about the money." A gentle breeze crossed the valley again, carrying the scent of dry grass beneath the fading afternoon sun. Colonel Whitaker stepped beside Walter, and without a single command or announcement, every veteran present instinctively stood a little straighter. One by one, hats came off. Conversations faded. Even people who had never served seemed to understand that they were witnessing something far more valuable than remarkable marksmanship. They were watching a lifetime of quiet discipline receive the respect it had never demanded. Walter closed the old rifle case with the same care he had shown when opening it hours earlier, lifted it effortlessly, and began walking toward the parking lot beside his old friend. No cameras followed immediately. No one wanted to disturb the silence. Long after the two men disappeared beyond the rows of parked trucks, the distant steel plate continued to sway gently in the evening light, reminding everyone who remained that true mastery never needed applause because respect is never measured by how loudly the world notices you, but by how quietly your character endures when nobody is looking.